everybody, and welcome back to a new Lesser Known History video. Today we are going to be talking about Sulla and the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. So this is a little bit about Sulla. So Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix was born in 138 BC and died in 78 BC. And this is a little bit just about him that will be important in the future. So he was born into poverty. His family was of a senatorial background, but they were disgraced. So they pretty much lost all that wealth. But even still, he received a very good education and was fluent in both Latin and Greek. And so a little bit about him that's, I guess, just out there is that he worked with poets, actors, and performers. And that's how he kind of gained a little bit of money and was able to get by for a little bit. And so he was a very gifted general, and he was an effective battlefield leader. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this is where he kind of got to start off in the Jugurthine War. So the Jugurthine War was fought between the kingdom of Numidia and ancient Rome. So Marius was the commander of the overall Roman forces, and Sulla served under him as a quaestor, but gained renown as a commander because there was a super important battle that was happening. And during this moment in time, Sulla took command of a defensive unit over a hill, and he was able to hold off the Numidian forces, and he gained a ton of renown as not only a commander, but as a good soldier. And so he was actually the person that did the political maneuvering to capture Jugurtha and brought him into the Roman, got him in Rome. And so it's pretty cool. He did all that, but Marius gained most of the renown for it. So these were some of his achievements after the war ended. So after the Jugurthine War, he bested the Cimbri and the Teutones in northern Italy and some Gaul and some Cisalpine Gaul. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about northern Italy, eastern France, Switzerland, and Austria. And so he gained the governorship of Cilicia, which is kind of in the east. He gained renown for reinstalling Ariobarzanes onto the Cappadocian throne out in eastern Anatolia at the time. And so he also fought off Tigranes the Great of Armenia. And after all this, so he pretty much reinstalled Ariobarzanes, who was displaced by Tigranes the Great, and afterwards fought off Tigranes the Great. So he went toe-to-toe with one of the greatest generals of the ancient era, or of the Roman Republican era, is how I would refer to it. And so he was hailed as Imperator by his men. And so for those of you that do not know, Imperator, or in Latin, Imperator, that just meant it was a sign of big respect. They pretty much hailed him as a great leader and that they would follow him. And so again, you start to see him gaining renown, and you can kind of see all of the, I guess, you can start to really see that his influence starting to build. And so we're going to talk a little about the Social War. So the Social War happened in Italy from 91 to 88 BC. And so during this time, Sulla served under Lucius Caesar. It's going to become important here in a second, or in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about the Social War. So the Social War was a war fought between the ethnic Romans and their allied tribes on the Italian peninsula, and then the Samnites, Etruscans, and other Italian ethnicities that lived on the Italian peninsula, but because they didn't necessarily want to be overwhelmed by ethnic Romans, but following the end of the war, they did become just full-on Romans. And this is where you kind of see the ethnic identities of the Samnites and the Etrurians kind of fall away. And so the following year, after starting to serve under Lucius Caesar, he was made praetor, and he led his army in the south of the peninsula. He won a decisive victory at the Battle of Nola. His troops awarded him the grass crown, which is the highest honor that you can be given in Rome. And so the whole point of it is it's a crown made of the grass of the battlefield that you fought on alongside your men. Is a sign of major respect in ancient Rome. And it's very, very cool to be awarded that. and it is the only award where, you don't award it to yourself, or a governmental body doesn't do that. The soldiers do that. And so he received universal praise from around the Roman state, and he then threw himself into the political ring. So we're going to see how that turns out. Well, not too well for Rome, but for Sulla, great. So he kind of does a little bit of political maneuvering, and he's helped by Mithridates VI, starting the First Mithridatic War. And so he began to attack Roman allies and territory in Anatolia and Greece. And Sulla was originally given the responsibility to fight a campaign against him out in the east. But Marius, who at this time he's around 7 years old, he wanted one last real big hoorah for his military campaign. And because of that, he did a little bit of political maneuvering and backroom deals, and the Roman Senate took Sulla's command away from him and then gave it to Marius. Now, mind you, you're about to take on an enemy kingdom that is genuinely preserved. You are about to take on an enemy kingdom that is seen as inferior to Rome. May not be the case, but to Romans, anybody that wasn't Roman was a barbarian. And so you're about to take on an enemy that was weaker than you, that had a lot of wealth, that could potentially add to the wealth of yourself. Because remember, Roman campaigns were very, very lucrative for those that fought in them. And so this would be a great way for Sulla to increase his wealth and personal standing. And seeing all this stripped away from him, he could not take this. So what did he do? He marched on Rome. So this is Sulla's first march on Rome, and there's a reason it's the first. And so when he arrived to the city of Rome, Marius and all of his allies had fled the city. And so because of that, Sulla tightened control over the Senate, and he made some lesser, not really too important proclamations, just kind of trying to consolidate himself and his allies there in Rome. And after doing this, he marched off to face Mithridates, and we will talk about how that goes here in a second. But the important thing to understand is that after he left, Marius returns to Rome, declares all of his proclamations void, and he actually begins to massacre the followers of Sulla. So this is starting to get really bad. If it wasn't already bad, it's starting to get much worse. So this is how the First Mithridatic War happens. It's from 89 to 85 BC, which if you're not haven't connected those dots originally, it starts while Rome is fighting the social war. And that's one of the main reasons why Mithridates wants to attack. Look at all this land out in western Anatolia and Greece that Rome had relatively recently conquered. Mithridates is from Pontus. This is a Greek style governance. And so Mithridates pretty much goes and tells all these Greeks, hey, what if we all rise up, or what if all of you guys rise up in 30 days and kill every Italian-born person in your cities? So in Mithridates' idea, he was going to do that and turn all the Greeks against the Romans and kill all these Roman citizens, because that would tie their fate to him. He understood that that they would not forgive him. And so this is what happens. So Sulla is very angry, and he marches over to Asia Minor and Greece, and he wins a massive victory at the Siege of Athens, which was actually the city that encouraged Mithridates to rise up against Rome. Chaeronea and then Orchomenus. Those are the three key battles that are fought both in Greece and in Anatolia. And so the Senate, at this point, since it's controlled by Marius, sent a second army to, and I put in quotations, relieve, because it was just there to kind of make him mad, just to say that they didn't support him. It was sent to relieve Sulla, but he took it as an insult once again, and he just kept fighting. So you had this weird dynamic where there were two Roman armies marching across Anatolia and Greece, fighting the same enemy, but they weren't in contact with each other. Like, you would have instances where they were maybe 15 kilometers, or for my for my American audience, that'd be like 10, 12 miles apart. And they just wouldn't interact with each other. It was like two separate worlds. So eventually Mithridates VI made a peace settlement with Rome, and I'm not really going to go into that because that's not important for the scope of what we're talking about here. That will be when I eventually cover the Mithridatic Wars. But for right now, all you have to understand is he made a peace with Rome, and Sulla was very happy. Now you see, one of the consuls that had been elected was killed by his own men because, and get this, one of the other military commanders in the other army that was sent to relieve Sulla, well, one of their officers went to garrison a town on his own. Well, guess what town that was? It was Byzantium, right? This is before Byzantium's a huge thing. And so he goes to occupy Byzantium. And so the consul's like, hey, you can't do that. And so he takes his men, but his men like the other commander better, so they kill him. So now Rome is left with one consul, because if you remember, Rome has two consuls, two people to, preserve all that around him, or preserve the power of the Roman state. And so this one is Cinna. So there are many Cinnas in Roman history. So this is one of them. And so Cinna, as the sole consul of Rome, decides that he, at this point, is going to push into Illyria because there are some Illyrian tribes that are threatening Rome. Now, this is completely separate from Sulla, but Sulla sees this as a threat, and he begins to gather his legions together. And this will become important because of what happens. Cinna marches his men through the mountains in the winter, which, as you can probably guess by the way Romans dressed, and the fact that it was winter in European mountains, it was very cold. They destroyed him. They stoned him to death. And so Cinna's dead. There are now no consuls in Rome. There is no governing. Those two governing people are gone. So seeing this power vacuum, Sulla gets 5 veteran legions and sets sail. So here's what happens. So his second march on Rome starts a civil war. So he marches with 5 veteran legions. So a legion at this time usually had between 4,000 and 5,000 fighting men. It was mostly around 4,000, but some legions would swell up to about 5,000. So when you take a look at this is between 20 and 25,000 of the absolute best troops Rome has. This would be like if a U.S. general of today went to march on Washington, D.C., but he had 25,000 Navy SEALs. Like, I don't think anybody could stop that, and at this point in time, not many people thought Sulla could, or nobody could beat Sulla. And so, interesting enough, every single person of the triumvirate that would come to pass after Sulla's death had some involvement with him. And 2 of them right now are Pompey and Crassus. And so even before we get into, Julius Caesar and the rivalry between Pompey, you can already see the difference between the two. Because Caesar was a big Marius supporter. I mean, he was related by, he was the son-in-law, so he was kind of related through family to Marius. And so it was this weird dynamic where they were already on opposite sides, and Crassus was as well. And if you look more into that dynamic in the future, Crassus and Pompey, for the most part, got along. And I say that, with, I have, like, quotation marks when I didn't put it on here, but, I say that with quotation marks because they, of course, had their own disagreements. They're very powerful men in their time. They're very ambitious. But you can already kind of see that divide. So he won multiple small victories in the Civil War, but it all led up to the Battle of the Colline Gate. Sulla and his armies then absolutely demolish the Marius factions men. But funny enough, Marius was not alive this time. He had died a little earlier, so he's kind of fighting a guy that is already dead. And so after this, he marches into Rome with his armies, victorious. And so he gets there, and the Senate proclaims him dictator. And then I'm going to say this in Latin and then tell you guys what this means. They say dictator legibus faciendis et republicae constituende causa. And so pretty much they say that you are a dictator and you are here to dictate the laws of Rome to its fullest extent. Now, the important thing about dictator or dictator, as they would call it, is that it had not been used since the Punic Wars. And usually this position is for 6 months. Well, right after this is proclaimed, the Roman senators amended the proclamation stating that there was no end date to his appointment. So pretty much Sulla would stop being dictator under 2 circumstances. 1, he dies. 2, he gives it up. So that is the first time where somebody had seized the powers of dictator by force. And we will see the consequences of this here in a little bit. But that is one of the number one things to take away from Sulla, is the sheer influence that he had, and honestly the fear that he caused and so many other people around him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the dictatorship. So his most infamous thing that he enacted were the proscriptions targeted at Marius' supporters. So for those of you that don't know what proscriptions are, pretty much Rome would create a list of people that were deemed as enemy of the state, and you could then go out and kill those people, and you would get paid money, and you would be able to get some of their wealth. Along that, slaves were not immune to it. They were considered wealth that you could gain, and the families of the people that were proscribed were not safe either. They could be killed for the sheer fact that they were related or they were in the same, familial line. So originally 1,500 noblemen, remember these are the wealthy Romans, many of them in the Senate worked for the government, they were proscribed, but nearly 9,000 people died. So it was insane. Many of them were innocent or guilty by association, but the main thing to take away from this is he neutralizes so much of the enemy or Marian support. And so he wanted to really undo some of the early reforms, and he wanted to increase the power of the aristocracy and by extension the Senate. He was a very traditional person. He directly opposed the Gracchi brothers, who were the 2 big reformers that came a little bit beforehand and kind of made it easier for the people in Rome. He was very centered around the Senate and the power of the aristocracy. And when I read through this legislation, you'll be able to see why. So these are a bunch of the important things that he passed. So, Senate must approve the legislation sent to the plebeian council. So for those of you that do not know, the plebeian council was a governing body that was made up of regular citizens. In Rome, if you were a plebeian, that just meant that you were a regular person. So when you say Senate versus the plebeian council is regular people, Senate is the aristocracy. And Rome had this governing system where the regular people and the aristocracy would make laws and veto laws and everything like that to make sure that there was power shared between the 2 branches. And so Senate must approve legislation sent to the plebeian council, so they no longer had say in that. So the tribune of the plebs, who was kind of like a consul, and I say that kind of because he did have some of the same powers as a consul, but he could still do he couldn't lead armies, but he could veto. And so he could no longer initiate legislation. The former tribunes could no longer serve in any other governmental seat. This was done because Sulla was able to realize that if you do that and prevent people from serving in the future, you would get the ambitious and therefore probably qualified individuals to no longer run for that seat. And so therefore making it kind of like a backwater seat. Pretty much if you ran and got that position, you could no longer be in politics. So it was a great way to neuter that support and power. And so tribunes could no longer veto Senate legislation, which was a power that was, again, for the regular people to veto the aristocracy. So he doubled the size of the Senate from 300 to 600 nobles and former government officials. And as you can expect, most of them were supporters of himself. Later on, Julius Caesar would go along and kind of do the same thing. So he put the courts under the control of the Senate and then increased the number of the courts, therefore giving the Senate more power. As you can see, again, a lot of this is the whole increasing the power of the aristocracy. Created the cursus honorum, which is the qualifications that one must go to be in office. He then reaffirmed the requirement that Roman citizens must wait 10 years before running for office again. He did this because he recognized the way that he was able to rise up. He understood that there was a huge potential that somebody in the future, and I say this winking because we all know what happens a little bit later with Julius Caesar, he foresaw that somebody else could potentially take the same way that he did. And so he wanted to try and stop that. And because he could, he just expanded the pomerium. For those of you that do not know, the pomerium is the kind of the sacred artificial circle that surrounds the important buildings of Rome. People were not allowed to cross the pomerium with weapons, otherwise they would be sentenced to death. So it was a very important symbolic thing for him to do that. So here is his legacy, and then eventually Julius Caesar. So Sulla stepped down as dictator when he was finished, and he retired to private life to write his memoirs, and there he died. So Sulla's march on Rome set the precedent for the future takeover of the nation by both Caesar and Pompey. So that's something not many people talk about, is the fact that Pompey technically was able to usurp power from the Senate before Caesar was. Just Caesar ended up winning, so that's why we talk about it more. But both of them were able to use their power and influence to influence the senators and influence the course of government at the time. And so Sulla was quoted in saying that he regretted not killing Caesar when he had the chance due to the young man's ambition for power. So it's ironic that Sulla had the ability to kill him, and he didn't, but he was able to recognize it. So you might be wondering, well, why would he have been killed? Well, Caesar was, by Roman standards, related to Marius in some way, shape, or form, but most of Caesar's family were Sulla supporters, and they convinced him not to. This is one of the greatest what-ifs in history. What if Sulla had killed Julius Caesar? This is one of those really important crossroads in world history, because Julius Caesar is one of the most consequential people in the history of the world. And so, most importantly, Sulla's political antics exposed the rot that had long since taken hold of Roman society and politics, and this would continue to be exposed by Julius Caesar and eventually Augustus when Augustus takes power. And so Sulla's family would continue to be important in Roman politics well into the age of the empire. Most of his legislation would be undone not long after his death, so on the legislative side, his legacy didn't really last. But his most important legacy, later, when Augustus took power, it completely fulfilled the total collapse of the Roman Republic and transformation into the empire. When he took power, he was able to complete the change that had been started when Sulla showed that you could take power. And so that was the full fulfillment. It took 3 generations, but it happened. And so Sulla today is a very controversial figure in history, much the same as Julius Caesar, same thing as Marius. He is both seen as a governing tyrant, as somebody that, limited the power of the people, but also as a great leader. And so it brings up the question whenever you talk about Sulla and Caesar, is it possible for 2 people or for a person to inhabit both titles? Can you be a bad person but still be a good leader? And that brings up questions of, is leadership being a good person? And there is no right or wrong answer to this. And if you guys have made it this far, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on Sulla and how he was, and what part do you think is true and what do you think is not about him. I am very fascinated to hear this. So I wanted to thank every single one of you for watching this video. I understand this was a different style of video compared to the last that I've done, but I really enjoyed this. But I would love to know what you guys thought. And so please leave that feedback in the comments. If you're listening to this and you like the video, please hit the like button. I'm really trying to grow this channel. Share the video if you want. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. I noticed that a vast majority of the people that watch my videos are not subscribed. So that would really help out the channel grow if you could. So without further ado, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Lesser Known History. Have a nice day.